Now that we've discussed exactly what folklore is, let's take some time to talk about how folklorists study it and what they do with their findings. I'm Cassandra Coleman, and this is the Folklore Tree. Given the stereotypes associated with folklore that we talked about last episode, you can probably guess that similar stereotypes tend to follow around the people who study it. Many people, upon hearing that someone is a folklorist, will ask them to tell a story or sing a song. And although some folklorists might pick up some, shall we say, interesting skills in the course of their research, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are able or willing to perform what they've studied. After all, how awkward does it make you feel to be put on the spot? For many folklorists, most of their work is decidedly behind the scenes in nature. Now, the application of folklore studies is largely split into two fields: academic and public. Now, academic folklore is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Studying and formulating theories, finding new and better ways to define genre, learning how particular types of folklore function within their communities, and documenting and sharing this with other folklorists to further our understanding of how it all works. Now, public folklorists are a little more hands-on in their work. Some folklorists work with communities to build museums and archives for the purpose of preservation and education. Others act as cultural mediators in international exchanges in business and medicine. Just more examples for why folklore is far more important than people give it credit for. It could be said that academic folklorists devise new ways of understanding, while public folklorists help the general public use these strategies to better understand each other. Folklore is just one of the many methods we can use to learn how to imagine each other complexly. Is it just me, or am I starting to sound like John Green? Now let's talk about one of the most important parts of studying folklore: collecting. Now, obviously, collecting is one of the most important parts of studying folklore because otherwise we wouldn't have anything to study. Collections make up the contents of archives and museums and also allow us to study forms of folklore that might be in decline. Now, obviously, it would be preferable for disappearing forms of folklore to continue to be circulated and passed on, but keeping and studying past records is definitely better than nothing. Now, collecting can be kind of tricky in a variety of ways. As you may remember from our last episode, one of the key characteristics of folklore is that it is transmitted informally. Now, for the majority of people who aren't on YouTube, and even some who are, it's pretty much impossible to act natural as soon as you have a camera or an audio recorder turned on you. You can think of it kind of like observing animals in the wild versus observing them in captivity. You might get many similar behaviors between the wild animals and the captive ones, but there are some behaviors that will only be performed in natural settings and can't be recreated in an artificial environment. For example, you might have a friend or a family member tell a story at a party that you think is really interesting or funny and you want to collect it. However, as soon as you turn the audio recorder on them, they don't tell the story the same way they did the first time. They might condense it or change the tone, especially if there's content that maybe isn't considered appropriate for mixed audiences. Oftentimes, people don't consider their stories or everyday rituals to be of any importance. In fact, they might claim that it's not folklore at all. This has happened to me more often than you might think. Much of this lies in the preconceived ideas that people have about what folklore is, as we discussed in the previous episode. Since it can be next to impossible to collect folklore in its natural environment, we have to consider something called context. Now, this is a word you're going to be hearing a lot, so you better get used to it. Now, context refers not just to the overall cultural context, like, say, North American weddings. It also involves the specific context of a single performance, for example, Cousin Tilly's second wedding. Now, we're going to go back to every literature class you've ever taken, but instead we're going to apply it to the study of folklore. Basically, context is the who, what, why, where, when, and how. But instead of just referring to the content of a story or a song, it also refers to the circumstances in which you heard it. That is to say, how was it told, why was it told, when, where, etc. The who, why, what, where, when, and how of folklore can be further organized into three main components as first outlined by Freudian folklorist Alan Dundes. The what is referred to as text, the who and where as context, and the how as texture. For example, a story about a distant relative is the text, told by grandparents over Christmas dinner is the context, and with a humorous tone is the texture. Now, the process of interviewing and collecting folklore from people is referred to as fieldwork. When folklorists conduct fieldwork, they also rely on the tools and theoretical models of many other fields such as anthropology, sociology, and history. One of the most interesting and challenging parts of interviewing informants for folklore is trying to keep the tone of the conversation as informal and comfortable as possible. This way you can still get the specific information that you need while also trying to best emulate the natural context in which these stories and songs or whatever you're collecting might have been transmitted. However, it's also important to remember that even a botched interview can contain valuable information about things like the context or the function of the folklore that's being transmitted. Make like Sherlock and make some deductions. Now, we haven't really talked much about the functions that folklore serves in society, mostly because that's another capital B big question. Now, Now, we haven't really talked much about the function of folklore in society yet, mostly because that's another one of those capital B big questions that we're going to try to answer over the course of this series. Make sure to keep in mind, though, that understanding the function of folklore in society is the reason why it's just as important to study the context as it is to study the content. Once we can begin to understand why we have certain types of folklores, in what situations it's used, and what it does for the people who are using it, we can begin to better understand each other in more complex ways. This has been an episode of the Folklore Tree. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.